whether you are a blacksmith or a spinner or sit around cutting out paper dolls and other pretty things, anytime you're at this site, particularly when you're wearing period clothing, you would know about food. That's the thing you would know about. You might not have a whole lot of information about the clothes you wear. It might just be, oh yeah, this is what we wear. But you would know what you had for breakfast and what you might be going to have for dinner. And you would have, even if you don't cook, back then you would have had a pretty good idea of how the cooking was done. So what Ann and Karen invited me here today to talk about is some of the basics, particularly the basic equipment and some of the basic foods, so that if you're guiding a group or if you just happen to wander by and somebody asks you a question about the kitchen, you'll have at least a kind of vague idea. Are we waking up?
Well, we're trying.
To get all this in your head, I think it's a good idea to involve all the senses. And there's some of the flavors and some of the aromas from the kitchen that are different back then. Some, when we walk into a kitchen and say, smells like pizza. That's not a smell you're going to have from the kitchens here. Because three things that we use a lot today that you would not be throwing in your pot back then. One is garlic, very, very rare back then in cooking. Another is oregano, and another is basil. So it's not that those were absolutely unknown, it's just those don't show up. So now, erase those three from your mind as far as your senses, your taste and your smell. And one of the things that is less common with us today that back then would have been common.
Ed's doing something.
Okay.
That's quite sure what he's trying to do.
I do have my laptop in the car.
Yeah, mine's.
We had it up. Trust me, we had it up.
Yeah.
5 minutes ago.
Yeah, it was working great.
It went to sleep.
I think it's what we do something.
It's on now.
Good, yeah. Okay. But I want to pass around this little bowl of mace. Mace is an herb that if you cook in the 18th century already or 19th, you know about. In the 21st century, you may not use it at all. But it's kind of the signature, one of the signatures of food back then. And what mace is part of the whole fruit of the tree that gives us the nutmeg. There's a fleshy kind of outer shell on the nut, and inside is this kind of a netting of mace.
Huh.
Inside that is a hard shell, and way inside all of that is the nutmeg. So mace and nutmeg are from the same tree.
All right, I'll let you take it from there.
Okay. Thinking about it. I'm going to pass this around, and what I would suggest is you take a little blade of the mace for your own and just hold it in your finger to kind of warm it up and get the scent, and then stick it in your pocket so you can pull it out later and be reminded. This isn't the only spice, but it's definitely the least familiar to us today.
I think we need to start the slideshow.
Yeah. Go to slideshow.
In the middle, third one from the right is slideshow.
Between animations and review.
Brand, do you want a piece of nice?
think, while we're sniffing, let's think about the equipment we would use in every kitchen here on the site. And every kitchen anywhere would have a nice metal pot. The two there on the left are good styles for all the 75 years you interpret here. Those little triangular ears and the rounded ears are good. You might also have a second pot or even a third across the way in the big house. But for the simplest of kitchens, a big iron pot would be basic. Could be the only thing, only as far as a pot goes. And think about what you might cook in that big old pot. Throw out some ideas.
Brunswick stew.
Yeah, some sort of a stew kind of a thing. Anything else?
Greens,
Greens, yeah.
jam and beans.
Yeah.
Render and lard.
Yeah, that too.
Rice.
All kinds of things. But if you're preparing a meal, the basic thing would be some sort of a stew or soup or a chunk of boiled meat and some vegetables. Now this is a really interesting recipe. And if you'll pass those around, please.
Okay.
Beef a la mode has nothing to do with ice cream. This recipe is such an interesting one. This is from a Virginia manuscript, may even come over from England, but a manuscript from the very early 18th century. You can tell by the handwriting it might be back in the 17th century. In Virginia, early 18th century, what does that have to do with us here? If you look on this sheet at the bottom, there's the same recipe, worded a little differently, simplified a little bit, but obviously from the same source, from 1847 South Carolina. So this evidently was a recipe that was passed along. It could have been kind of straight on, like somebody from that Virginia plantation married somebody in Charleston. It could have been as straightforward as that. It could have been they both used the same old cookbook. Who knows? But there are a lot of things we can learn from this. And one particular thing is about the flavoring. The first couple flavorings are bacon and salt and pepper, good old Southern food, soul food. But beyond that, we've got the spices. And there's our nutmeg and mace. This beef a la mode called also for cloves. Cinnamon, allspice, ginger, all of those are common. But you can see there really well the fresh mace, how it's bright red on the outside of the little shell that hides the nutmeg. And herbs are the next thing. Our recipe here calls for, I believe, a handful of sweet herbs. Now, sweet herbs don't necessarily mean sweet. Parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, all those expected things. Here we have a little bit of marjoram and chives as well. And even things like spinach and lettuce were considered herbs, sweet herbs, pot herbs. There's not much, vegetables weren't considered a wonderful thing in themselves. There was a lot of gray area between what's a herb and what's a vegetable. So we've got spice, we've got herbs. Beyond that, something tart, something to balance the sweetness, tartness. And in the case of our beef a la mode, it's claret, with mostly any kind of wine or vinegar or lemon juice to balance that. And then the fourth thing, the magic ingredient, the thing that the Japanese call umami, but that's not a word to use in your 18th or 19th century kitchen, that depth of flavor, the deliciousness. And our beef a la mode has a couple anchovies in it, which sounds pretty weird and pretty awful unless you're an anchovy fan. But it just disappears and just adds that mysterious depth of flavor. Mushrooms do the same thing, and then some of our strongly flavored vegetables like onion and carrot and celery, those sorts of things. All that adds to that deliciousness factor. Well, okay, we've got our meat or vegetables or whatever in the pot. We've got our seasonings. But if you have just one pot and you have company coming, what might you do? And so you might add something else to that pot, even something that can function as a side dish, like maybe stuffed cabbage or cabbage pudding. And most anything can furnish a stuffing. It can be, with the cabbage, some sort of leftover cooked meats and vegetables and herbs. Could be a bread kind of stuffing, could be fruit. So all kinds of things could go into that cabbage. And then the leaves are pulled back over and it's tied up and could be set on top of our beef a la mode and allowed to cook along with it. Or it can be tied up in a cloth and boiled separately. And this cabbage could be just a nice meal in itself when you're doing a demonstration. Just that. It's a lot of fussing with it to get it in the pot, and then it looks so fun in the pot. So that's a good kind of demonstration thing. But let's think about what else you might tie up in a cloth and throw into the pot. This is my favorite kind of 18th century cooking. It's just so magical in the way it turns out, and it's so peculiar seeming, but it's the way that I cook rice in the 21st century. It's just so tidy. You put your rice in a cloth like that. This is all ready to drop in a pot of water for Kay and Fred's supper one night soon. That'll go in the pot of water and the rice will cook. It's called rice pudding, and some rice puddings back then had some custard and some fruits and things in it, but the basic rice pudding was just this. And it makes that really pretty ball of rice. Makes a really, really pretty presentation. And then you just shake your cloth outside over the porch rail and wash it, and you're set for the next go. The Carolina snowballs are similar, but there's a peeled and cored apple in the middle of the rice, which is really nice. And I bet you've cooked those a lot down here. I know that at least one person I know has. Now, in those cases, you want the water to come into your pudding, into the cloth. In the case of this spinach pudding, which is kind of custardy bread pudding kind of pudding, you don't want the water and the pudding to get together. So you put something on the cloth for a barrier, like butter or flour to keep the water out and the pudding in. And that's the one that's just magic. You have this cloth come out of the pot and then this pretty, it's kind of like,
Yeah, it does.
what?
That bottom, that spinach pudding looks good.
It really is good. That's something that, there again, I've been known to just cook for a lunch or supper in the summer for us, just in the 21st century, because it really is. It's like a quiche without the custard. Well, another good trick with your big pot is jugging. It's like the answer to your crock pot, I guess. It's kind of a double boiler kind of idea. But in the upper left corner, we have the beginning of a jugged hare. You've got the pieces of rabbit. And here we have our seasonings we should have. You see an onion for that depth of flavor. It has, you can see at least one of the cloves stuck into it for spice. There's our bundle of sweet herbs. And there's probably a blade or two of mace thrown in there and a little dash of white wine, or a big dollop of white wine, and then covered with a cloth or a plate or a towel and set into boiling water. And it cooks, that would need to cook a good 4 hours because you're starting with raw meat. But something like a hash or a hodgepodge from leftovers could be put into the crock and set in the boiling water, and that would just cook in an hour or two and just meld together all those good flavors. But, I mean, how tidy and handy, and for a busy person in the kitchen, that doesn't take much attention, whereas something like roasting would. So down there at the right, we have our jugged hare, and you see the little onion there for a little side bit of relish to go with it, and the Carolina snowballs to serve with it. that'd be a pretty wonderful meal from just your big old pot.
Yeah.
Now, puddings were often these things boiled in a cloth or just boiled in a pot, but a lot of things that we would call pies nowadays were puddings back then. Right, like particularly that potato custard at the bottom is what we'd call sweet potato pie. It's, but they would call it, the old recipes might call it potato pudding even, but baked in a pastry. And just one of the more interesting of all the recipes, one I've had so much fun researching lately, are all the ancestors of chess pie. You're not going to find chess pie in the old recipe books. What you will find are lots and lots and lots and lots of lemon puddings and transparent pudding. And all in the world, any of those recipes is like the one up there at the top that comes from a Moravian lady, but this shows up in English cookbooks and the French cookbooks of the time. So it was something everybody liked, but you can see there it's half-pound sugar, half-pound of butter, 10 eggs, and then whatever flavoring. In that case, it's wine and lemon. In the transparent pudding that's pictured there, it's the same proportion of butter and sugar and roughly the same proportion of eggs. Egg size would differ. But what's different, and so it's exactly the same, it just doesn't have the wine in it, that the recipe at the top. But here's what's interesting about it. All through the 18th century, it would be that half-pound of sugar for that proportion of butter and eggs. All through the 19th century, it'd be a half-pound of sugar for all that, which is a cup of sugar. Now, by 1950, sometimes it's still called transparent pie, not pudding anymore, but pie. Sometimes it's called chess pie, and it has 2 cups of sugar as opposed to 1 with the same egg and butter. And you get to the late 20th century, it's 3 cups of sugar. And some recipes you find up to now have
Oh my gosh.
4 cups of sugar for that same half-pound butter and 8 or 10 eggs.
It's horrible.
Isn't that the story of our eating habits?
Amen.
And you know what?
Amen.
I want you to try this original recipe because it is heavenly. You just wouldn't want it any sweeter than that. And the lemon just sings through it. And haven't you eaten chess pie that was so sweet it just didn't taste?
Yeah.
Almost made your teeth hurt?
Yeah.
It's still pretty good. But the original is just heavenly.
Would you address the size of eggs, please?
Yeah, that's a good question, the size of eggs. And yeah, I'll address it. I'll say again, they differed. You know, it's hard to know. And it would probably, if in your kitchen with the ingredients laid out, it looks really nice to have a real assortment of sizes. And but generally, I just count on, with the old recipes, using medium eggs, figuring that's maybe a good in between. These chess pie recipes, sometimes the 10 eggs is pretty heavy in egg compared to other recipes. And you'll see a whole chart in my new book that has chronologically of the recipes, and you'll see that the egg differs a little bit from about 6 to 10 in this size recipe. The one I've charted is half that bigger recipe.
Miss Kay,
Yes.
Is that, you think it's because most chickens at that time were bantams?
Well, bantam is
Right.
way little.
Most chickens were bantams at that time.
Oh, Fred, you're more a chicken guy. More the game
I don't know.
is what we assume.
I mean, one of the books I've read recently
Uh-huh.
talking about said there were not any true full-size chickens like we have today.
Oh, well, I
18 inch.
agree with that.
Right.
But Bantam is so small, I think it'd be more like a
Right.
scraggly
True lamb
game.
can't be over 16 ounces. You know, I'm talking
Yeah.
about rooster. Can't
Yeah.
be over 16 ounces.
That's interesting, yeah. I
I mean,
wouldn't.
I'm just asking. I mean,
Yeah, I don't know, but I do know they would have been I am pretty sure they were smaller in general, and so, which is why I think today's medium eggs, or, sometimes if I'm doing a lot of cooking, it's fun to have a
Well, we were
small,
feeding-
medium, and a few large, just to show the difference in size.
Well, we were feeding them corn and cracked corn and stuff like that then, and today we feed them.
Or bugs and grass.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Can I ask a question? Where the word chess pie come from?
There are a couple ideas, and there's that silly story about the old cook that made such great pie, and somebody kept asking her, "What kind of pie is it?" She said, "Oh, it's just pie."
It's just pie.
What I think makes more sense, probably more reasonable, I said that a lot of those recipes were called lemon pudding or transparent pudding. A few were actually called cheesecake.
Oh, okay.
That some old cheesecake recipes are what we call cheesecake, and some of them are more like the other kind of chess pies, the kind with cornmeal or flour in them, or the kind with milk in them.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the old cheesecake recipes are actually the absolute very same recipe. So I think, cheese chess makes a little more sense than chess pie. Now, to bake something like a pie, you need an oven.
Yes.
And around here, there's only one of your kitchens with an actual oven. And do y'all ever actually use that oven? Has it ever actually been used?
The one that's in the brick kitchen
Yeah.
on the 19th century side?
Yeah.
It smokes.
It
It
smokes.
doesn't draw raw.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's good to talk about. And with that, you can do just any kind of baking in quantity. With a Dutch oven, you're limited, but you're really only limited by the size of what you're baking. You can bake anything in a Dutch oven that will fit. And so those pies bake great. That's the big picture up on the left is a great Dutch oven of old type. With there again, you got those little pointy ears. You got nice high legs and the rim to keep the coals on top. The one down there on the hearth is 20th century style. That's not such a good one at all to use in our historical setting, but it works just fine. It's just the style is, you can see the difference in style.
Mm-hmm.
Now, pies that were called pies, not puddings back then, were the fruit pies and the meat pies. And here's just good old apple pie with crinkum cranks. Isn't that a great word? Crinkum crank. Well, I could tell from context what they meant. They meant decorate your pie fancy. And so, but I went to the big Oxford English Dictionary and looked up crinkum crank and found out it means little twisty ornaments. And so it's decorations for your crinkum cranks. But you do have to be careful because crinkum crank is a great word, great 18th century word, but right above crinkum crank in the dictionary is crinkum, which is venereal disease. Go crazy with your discussion of crinkum cranks, but I wouldn't really bring up any crinkums. You never know. Now, pies bake fine in your Dutch oven and things like cornbread and such. What we would call cookies, but back then that word cookie wouldn't really show up in your vocabulary probably. It would be little cakes. And those bake great in a Dutch oven. But if you think about baking a batch of cookies, batch of little cakes, that's an all-day project, baking maybe a half a dozen at a time. Is that practical? That would be unlikely, unusual. You know, maybe if you're just one crazy woman that loves a little cake, you might do it at Christmas time in the Dutch oven. We all do it all the time because it's such a great ongoing demonstration. But I think the point that this would be extra special because this is really labor intensive. And cake's the same way. You can bake it in one baking, but it does take some real care to get your oven just right, keep it just right through a long baking like that. Cakes at the time are interesting that they were basically, if someone were going to eat cake, it was one of two things. It was either pound cake that might have lots of fruits or might have caraway. The other kind is what we would call a sweet bread or even a coffee cake. So cake was either a pound cake or a yeast bread. Because there weren't any chemical leavenings, that's the difference. Until the end of your period here, you could start having soda and such. But before the turn of the century, it would just be eggs or yeast. Now, as there are two kinds of cakes, there are two kinds of icings that seem to predominate. One is a meringue, just egg white and sugar. The other is actually macaroon. It's pounded almonds with egg white and sugar. And this wedding cake down in the lower right, each of those layers were baked in a Dutch oven in a cooking class, and they followed the wedding cake recipe to put the almond icing on first, roll out the macaroon mixture and drape it over the layers, and then the meringue icing on top of that, and let it harden in a warm place overnight, which is just beautiful. And you cut it, and it just falls apart because of that. You know what a meringue would do, which it doesn't look very pretty in the serving. It's pretty sturdy before you serve it. But think of this, that if a plum cake, the wedding cake had currants and raisins and candied lemon and orange and almonds in the cake itself. Imagine a bite of that flavor, with a little bit of rose brandy to flavor it. And then with that bite of cake, you got a little bite of the almond icing and then a little bite of that meringue. Think of it.
Heaven.
Well, I think though really cooking a cake like that again would be pretty special. And if you had all those lovely ingredients, the dried fruits and the nuts and the candied fruits, you're more likely to make a plum pudding. Because there you've got about the same ingredients, tied in a cloth, dropped in your pot of boiling water. All you have to do all day is make sure it doesn't boil dry. So that's a lot easier, more foolproof. You're not going to ruin those ingredients by burning your cake on the bottom. You're just going to, it's pretty foolproof. Now there are of course, plenty of other utensils. There's all sorts of pans, and whether to call things a spider or a skillet or a frying pan, whether it's a saucepan or just a pot or a pan, I can't get straight on that in reading the old sources. I named these by what they were named in museum collections. You know the little saucepan that you all have in your collection that was cast at the William Hill Iron Works? I don't think you actually use it. I wonder if you have it actually on site to talk about. It's probably in the collections at the museum. But that's such a wonderful piece, and this frying pan in the middle is a similar form to that saucepan that's more of a, deeper, more deep. Earthenware is great at the fire, except it takes special care if a hot coal or a lick of flame touches a ceramic container, it will crack right off. So you can use it, and it works great. You just keep your earthenware to the side of the fire so that it gets the radiant heat, or on warm ashes, but not next to the coals or the flame. So that little pipkin is handy, but you gotta watch it. Some of you have probably had the same experience I have, of all of a sudden you hear that bing, and you know it happened. And a gridiron would be pretty basic, however, to broil things, and with all the grilling nowadays, we have a pretty good handle on that. That's a tricky one that's in the Mazda collection, that has that trough to catch drippings. A rotating trivet's great. There are all kinds of simple trivets that I'm sure you use. I love a rotating one because if your pan's too hot on one side, you just twist it around instead of having to lift it and lug it. A griddle is pretty basic of some sort. It can be a hanging griddle, or just a piece of metal propped up over the fire. But that's how you cook your corn cakes, which would be basic. We should cook a lot more corn cakes in period demonstrations than we do. We always like to do the fancy stuff, and that's more fun and maybe more interesting to visitors, but it doesn't get across the story like just good old corn cakes. What's cooking here on the griddle are muffins, which are kind of fun, and they're special, but they're not unduly so that's something to do sometimes. Those are wheat muffins. There are corn muffin recipes for your into the 19th century side of things, for sure. Not too much in the 18th. And there are other ways to cook your cornbread too, on a board, like this little bannock board. But ash cakes are the basic thing that, again, we don't do this. I see Linda back there laughing. That's always kind of the indoctrination when I teach a class. You have to eat your ash cake first, and then we'll go on and do something else. But if you're a little fancy, you put the leaf around the cornbread before you bury it in the ashes. You don't have to. You can just bury it right in the ashes, blow off the ashes, and eat it. But wrap it in a cabbage or collard leaf, and not only does it taste better and less ashy, but look how pretty it is with that leaf design in it. Of course, a board's good for other things, like planking a fish. Just amazing. You tie the fish on the board, and it cooks right through. You don't turn it or anything. Just prop it beside the fire to get the radiant heat. And cooks pretty fast. You can stuff the fish with herbs. Really good touch. Or a little bit of lemon. And of course, lots of things can just be roasted by setting next to the fire with the radiant heat, as well as burying in ashes. And then that beautiful bird there was cooked on a spit. That's one of the basic things we think of, and is a good thing to do, but that takes a lot of attention too, as opposed to just throwing your chicken into your big iron pot. What you can do when you have that some kind of a stew going, about the last hour, hour and a half of that, you can truss up a chicken and throw that on top of your stew. Then pull it out and serve it as a separate dish. So there, in your iron pot, you can have a whole chicken, and you can have something stewed up too. But of course, there are other ways to cook your chicken. And here's the first step. That's a wonderful manuscript. It was a little cookbook penned by a schoolboy, young man, whose aunt knew he was really good with penmanship and was clever with the drawing, and she got him to make a cookbook to sell at the ladies' fair coming up in Virginia somewhere in the mid-1800s. And it is just the most curious little book. Now, down there on the lower left is your chicken on a spit. Up at the top is your other trick that I know some of you have used of hanging it on a string, which acts as a spit. You just have it up beside the fire so that it gets that radiant heat. And then that funny little business of burying things in coals, you can bury a whole small chicken, never tried it with a big chicken, you can wrap it in cabbage leaves or collard leaves and bury it in warm ashes and then pile it with coals. In an hour and a half you have, this particular chicken was done that way. Isn't that curious? So, you can have a pretty big feast just with your big iron pot and your Dutch oven. I judge you can make this whole table full. And I also judge that this is as big a feast as you would ever have around here, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I think we sometimes try to do too much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's think about it. Well, the bird was cooked on a spit. That's a goose, I believe. I don't know why we did 3 pumpkins that day. I'm kind of remembering that we were having a disagreement of how to stuff it, or else we had way too many pumpkins or both, and we ended up several people doing pumpkins. So I think 1 would probably be enough for this table. But beyond that, I think it's a pretty typical, wonderful feast. There to the left of the chicken in the Dutch oven would be a meat pie, a sea pie, which is just the ultimate special dish because it takes more ingredients and more attention than just throwing it all in your big pot. This particular one, I believe, had cured pork, ham, and rabbit and quail. And then the crust on top you can see there, barely see there. I think the beets would have had to been cooked in your pot first if you just had 1 pot, or maybe you cooked those yesterday, or maybe you have a separate little pot that you cook the beets. But everything else then could come out of your big pot. You've got some there with the cabbage. Around the cabbage you have some sort of, I think it's probably beef gobbets, or some sort of beef stew with the carrots and turnips. So that would be what started out in your pot. So imagine putting on the beef with pretty much liquid. The Carolina snowballs, the apple, the rice up on top there, the 3 or 4, those would be dropped in as the beef was starting to simmer. You'd drop the apples in. An hour later you'd pull those out and you'd have your snowballs ready. By that time you'd have your cabbage all stuffed, ready to go in, and that's the point where you'd probably put your carrots in too. And so you get really 4 dishes in one. You get the snowballs, you get the cabbage, you get the stewed beef and carrots, and you have the bowl of sauce or gravy, all from your big iron pot. And just that would be a really fine dinner without the bird and the pie and the pumpkin. So there's a lot. I want to put to you the challenge to see what you can do with just your iron pot and maybe your Dutch oven and your fire. And I think it's going to be pretty amazing. Yes?
What was in the bowl between the apples, the Carolina?
Beets.
Okay.
And those you couldn't cook with everything else for obvious reasons.
That's what you said would have been.
Yeah, I could have, might have done that yesterday, might have done that real early before you stirred your beef. So, questions, thoughts, ideas?
If you're cooking things in shifts, I mean, we like everything to come to the table at one time so everything is
Yeah.
hot at the
Yeah.
same time. So obviously that's not a concern.
Well,
I mean, things.
yes and no. Now, let's take what about the jugged hare with the snowballs? With that, you would need to cook your snowballs either first or after, because the pot's full of your jugged hare. What I would I might do it either way, because the snowballs are fine. It would just lukewarm, room temperature. What I would probably do with that though is do the rabbit, because that takes 4 hours to get it really lovely like that was in the dish. Then you could set that just by the fire to continue warming and continue stewing just a little for the hour that the snowballs took. So that would, and that's a lovely dinner. For the one with the cabbage and the snowballs going in the pot, I think in that you would just have to have the snowballs lukewarm or room temperature or cold, depending on the temperature out. The other thing though that I find in hearth cooking, and especially in cold weather, nothing's hot by the time you eat it anyhow. I just have quit trying to go crazy about everything perfectly hot. I wonder if that was even a thing back then. I know fresh bread wasn't considered good till the next day. There's something unwholesome about straight from the oven. I don't know how they could have thought that. For a lot of reasons, I don't know how they would have thought that. Well, I know you all have a tight schedule today, but I'd love to answer questions, or I'd love to have you come up and sniff my rose brandy particularly, which is simply just brandy poured over fragrant rose petals and allowed to set. And
Wow.
You're gonna use that as an ingredient in cooking?
yeah, where today we would use vanilla, then it would be rose water, orange flower water, or the rose brandy is my favorite.
My goodness.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Any special roses or just any fragrant roses?
Any roses that are fragrant, and that haven't been sprayed. Yeah, so definitely not any roses from a florist or from a fancy rose gardener, because that person's definitely sprayed theirs. I have a couple heirloom roses, a Shaler's Provence and a apothecary rose that I use, but those aren't. It doesn't have to be an heirloom rose, just so it smells nice. Those crazy old. What are those crazy roses I complained about all the time? Yeah, knockout roses. Unnatural roses, and they don't smell. They have a pretty color. They can add some color to it. Yeah.
What about foods that would help the constitution or considered medicinal in nature?
Oh, golly, that's a whole other subject, and it's one I'm only moderately have only moderately on the top of my head right now. But like I say, their understanding was way different from ours, and what was available was way different. The big medicinal thing was those new fresh greens this time of year.
Okay.
I mean, right now you can go out and get a nice mess of chickweed and cook that up or make a salad from it. And it really was a miracle drug if you think about the vitamin deficiencies this time of year. So, and pretty soon the creasy green's going to be coming up. You got some nice field violets coming along. There's greens this time of year would be the magic thing. Vegetables, like I said earlier, were more considered maybe poverty food in a way if you didn't have enough meat, but also they were considered more for flavoring and color, and because they did like to have lots of cream cranks on their food, so a pretty bright vegetable would be a nice decoration. They even talk about cutting slices of carrot and pieces of beet in this would be Linda's thing, in shapes to decorate your dish with. You could make her give up her paper dolls and have her make some crinkle cranks for your next dinner.
You said that about the vegetables being, poverty food. It made me just think about what Wood Mason wrote in his journal. It said he had been separated from the path, and said, he had no meat or cheese to sustain himself, and he said, therefore I had to eat cucumbers and squash and other such trash that the Presbyterians ate.
That is a good, you can count on wood mason. And he carried, don't know if it was, I think it was brandy and biscuit with him and cheese for after that, I guess. But he particularly didn't want to count on the local. There's the fella stopped at a house somewhere around here that talked about oh gosh, it's in that book over there. I'm not pulling it out, but something about the filthy Scots-Irish household where he was afraid to even drink anything. So he went out and got his biscuit from the car. And biscuit not being what we're thinking, it's like a cracker, like a hardtack.
Hardtack, yeah. Well, did they make any hardtack up here?
Yeah, they did. They called it biscuit.
Yeah. Okay.
They didn't call it hardtack, probably. Yeah, I'm not sure when that came along, but it was hard biscuit or biscuit.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Kate does have her book with her newest book. And we got some in the gift shop as well. For us if you want to pick up one of her books.
Yeah.
So, all right, what we're going to do next, we're going to go out on site and we're going to visit the 3 different kitchens. We're going to start in the brick kitchen where Dontavius is doing some cooking. We're going to then move over to the slave cabin, and Sanja is in there, and then we'll end up at McConnell's to see what's going on with Bob there in the 18th century as well. So there is one restroom here that we will pass if any